It's really essential that the domicile is established at the place where the magic happens, where the real business activity is going to take place.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Peter, Patrick, a very warm welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Hi, Silvan. Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
Peter, you are the team head of executives and entrepreneurs at UBS. And you, Patrick, are a tax expert at the wealth planning team in Switzerland, also at UBS. So you are basically the perfect guys to talk to when it comes to taxes, to wealth planning, and also potential retirement plans. So let's dive in right with the first question. In your experience, how do young founders deal with topics such as pension plans and taxes?
Yeah, I mean, as you might imagine, young startup founders definitely have other things on their mind, right? They won't even think about taxes and provision planning. They have a business idea, they have a project they want to push forward. So when the banker typically shows up and says, you know, you should discuss the risk and think about what could happen in the future, that's normally not a very welcome topic, I would say.
Yeah, and another factor is that taxes and pensions are not necessarily attractive topics. So for young entrepreneurs, they're rather perceived as a necessary evil. Mm-hmm. But both factors are therefore quickly forgotten or postponed, continuously postponed. And in addition, in the past, usually these entrepreneurs, they didn't have to care about the topics. They were employed, and it was practically all done by the employer itself. So they didn't have to think about it. And once starting off yourself, you really take over the responsibility to really care about taxes, care about your pension fund and all these issues, and give them really the importance the topics need. Absolutely.
In that regard, Peter, there are multiple ways how you can actually become an entrepreneur. What are the different options that you can choose from?
Yeah, I mean, as Patrick just mentioned, there is the possibility that you actually kind of drop out from a corporate job where everything is organized. You have your fixed salary, you have your pension fund, and you don't even have to think about too much about these topics. But there is also the possibility to become an entrepreneur directly after your studies, something we see even more students becoming directly entrepreneurs. So founding your startup really depends on where you are in your life and what does it mean financially. Of course, there is, besides, founding your own company based on a business plan you have, there is also the possibility to buy an existing business, which means you need some existing cash in order to finance that. There are definitely different ways to become entrepreneurial. Yeah.
So in that regard, Patrick, what influence does becoming an entrepreneur actually have on the financials, the taxes, and also the pension situation in such a case?
Well, basically, becoming an entrepreneur means also tapping into your private funds and savings. And you really have to think about how you're going to proceed with a lower salary and so on in the future, what usually is the case, especially at the beginning. A stable salary and the pension fund are usually no longer just provided. So you really have to think, what does this mean for my private wishes, my private plans? And you have to be very aware of the impact.
You want to add something?
I mean, let's say, I think to become an entrepreneur, and both of ours are, and so we can't really tell, but I think becoming an entrepreneur also means, being eager and ready to take risks and actually to jump a bit into the cold water, leaving behind some of the security you have. I think it's finally this that in the future might bring you also the rewards for taking that risks in the early days. So without taking any risks, you will never become an entrepreneur. So you also have to take risks financially from that perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you've worked with multiple entrepreneurs, with multiple companies. From your experience, what are the important success factors or ingredients when you actually start out? What can make or break your successful startup?
I'm not an investor, startup investor, so I might be the wrong person to ask. But what we also really see, it's team, and team. So it's super important who you start your company with. We have seen companies with great ideas in growing markets. So they were actually ready, set up for success, but they weren't nicely set up as a team. They weren't aligned about their values maybe, and they weren't diverse enough. So I think the team is super important, and maybe from a banking or tax perspective, or wealth planning perspective, you have to keep in mind where the founders actually stand in their life. Because if you have, for instance, a young founder who is, financially independent, lives in a small apartment, no big fixed costs, it might be easier to say, okay, let's bootstrap and keep costs low and income low. And there might be another person already having family, having a different bank background, might be important for this person to get already some salary. So you have to make sure where you stand and make sure you very early on discuss with the team on what you want to reach as a team. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe in addition, I think the team is not only relevant internally, it's one of the main points, definitely, but also look at your external team or the stakeholders. You can ask the very first questions if you have problems and so on. Who can you address to? And I see people like other entrepreneurs, consultants, lawyers, incubators, friends, family, and so on. These are very key to drive a business successfully into a next life cycle.
Yeah, and you actually already mentioned it before, Peter, like the personal finances play a crucial role. They determine how much money you also need to earn as an entrepreneur to be able to finance your life, basically. What other role do personal finances play in that regard when you actually start a company? Because it doesn't only affect you as a person, but also your company potentially.
Yes, of course. And that's why we also argue that it's super important to very early on have a business plan where you actually plan also the liquidity needs of the company, which is also the basis then for the financial requirements you have. And then based on this, you can decide, is it possible to actually finance this business with your own funds by what we call bootstrapping, where you use existing funds and maybe keep your salaries low in order not to bring in external investors. So you keep a large portion of the cake on your own. Or if there is early on a need already to bring in additional investors to make the company grow. So we believe the liquidity planning of the company in the first place, and then making sure it works out with your private liquidity is super important. And here again, the founders might have different starting points from a financial perspective, and that's where you have to make sure the company participation stays in line with the power also of these founders who bring their brain to the table.
Yeah, and if you need a business plan for the company, you definitely need a kind of a business plan for your private side as well. It's very important. If you look at the private side of an entrepreneur, it's essential to know how much funds do I really need to cover my expenses, to cover my way of living and so on, and how much of your own funds you really can contribute to the business. It's very essential to have a clear mind and picture about that thing. And basically also if it's also possible to draw pension assets. Do you want to? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage? Maybe we come to that point a little bit later on as well. And what does it mean privately for you? So is there really also a need for a private non-touchable reserve you need to have? All these questions, really, you should draw your private business plan as well. That's what we usually do recommend.
Yeah, I really like that take, because often you only think about the business plan for your company, but not for your personal life. So that's crucial that they also align.
That typically gets forgotten, and that's also where we come into play and very early on address these topics, because we believe them to be very important. Yeah,
absolutely. So when you actually found your company, you're also faced with the decision where, geographically speaking, you actually found it. So in that regard, where is the best place to establish the company from a tax and financial point of view?
Let's ask the tax guy.
Yeah. So basically, you're absolutely right. The tax burden is very different from canton to canton. We speak of profit taxes between, 12 to 20%, depending where you locate. But I think especially at the beginning, when a company is maybe not profitable, you're not break even at the moment, taxes are a minor factor in how to evaluate a domicile. I think in the long end, it's really essential that the domicile is established at the place where the magic happens, where the real business activity is going to take place, and that's essential and has definitely an impact on future profits. Then, further things to be considered tax-wise, but as I mentioned, tax is only one factor. Is especially, for example, research-intensive companies. They can maybe claim their expenses for research against the profit tax, which might be a big topic in the future. And for example, the corporate tax reform gives you certain advantages or disadvantages, and they vary from canton to canton. So it's wise to choose wisely, in my opinion. Yeah.
So do your own research, basically, do your homework.
Exactly. And of course, it's always possible to change domicile, of course. So if you start up at your own cellar, basically, and then you move on from place to place, you can change domicile anytime within Switzerland. So there's no big issue.
Do you have anything to add, Peter?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's interesting to hear that the tax guy says that taxes are not that important, but I think he's right. Very early on, it's much more important that you get access to talent. And that you have an environment that inspires you. So places to start to look for where you can start your companies. Maybe if you find in some sectors already existing startups, other companies that are domiciled in a certain area, let's say Schlieren for biotech, medtech, or let's say Technopark, where you really have an environment where you get to know other entrepreneurs that might help you out on your journey. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's much more beyond the pure tax reasons where you should actually locate your company.
Absolutely, in particular in the beginnings, yeah.
Right. Another important decision that you actually face is the choice of your legal form. So how important is that choice from your perspective, Patrick?
In my opinion, very important. It shows you very early a little bit the way to the future and how much flexibility you have with a company and what ways you can or cannot take in the future. So therefore, if we speak of a legal form, we usually divide between individual companies or the corporation or GmbH in Switzerland. And first of all, the individual company, it's very easy to set up and basically opens the possibility as well, what sometimes the intention is, to draw also money out of the pension fund. And therefore, you really have to question yourself, do you really want to use the pension capital? Even though it's your own company, it's still venture capital. So you really have to think hard about that. On the other hand, also individual companies, there's a liability issue. You're liable with your overall wealth, basically, if something goes not the way you intend to. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, I think the individual company is definitely more for a one-man show than for a fast-growing company in the market. If you once want to have investors, business partners, and so on, it's usually not possible with an individual company. And on the other hand, frankly spoken, the AG or the GmbH, they're nowadays almost the same, but still they have a few differences. Entry capital usually is known, 20,000 with the GmbH. It's a lower hurdle to start, of course, but it's also a little bit less flexibility than the corporation. And especially if you're in a scalable business again, looking for investors and so on, you get more flexibility with the corporation. And also the GmbH at the moment is slightly more transparent when it comes to public knowledge of ownership and so on. So if possible, if you're really this kind of startup guy looking forward and growing a company very fast, you best start off with a corporation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we have seen some GmbHs being converted into corporation, into classical AGs at the later stage, the latest in a growth phase where you need additional investors. That's definitely a point in time where you change your legal form in order to benefit from all the advantages this legal form gives you. And it's also necessary to bring professional investors on board.
Yeah, they don't want to be fully transparent in that regard and be in a public register.
Absolutely.
Most often.
Yeah.
So in that regard, we talked about the choice of the legal form, but I can imagine that this also has, of course, some influence on your pension provision. So what would you actually recommend there? What is important there to also consider in terms of the legal form choice related to the pension provision?
As mentioned before already, if you have an individual company, it's all about your own responsibility to really take care of your pension and pension fund system and perspective. There's no compulsory risk insurance, no compulsory savings obligation, no nothing basically. So if you don't take care of that, you don't have nothing, to be honest. And for example, if you are self-employed and you do not plan, you may face quite a dramatic situation if something happens to you, if you get ill or if you have an accident. So from social security point of view, there's only the first pillar who's paying something. And in best case, that's roughly 28,000 in Swisses. And that's for all your life, basically, and you don't get anything else on top of that. So it's definitely something you really have to have a focus on, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So it's definitely, you still have some safety nets, but they are much weaker than with an AG or GmbH.
Absolutely, and with the AG, of course, a lot comes on the mandatory part. So exactly. you're the employer of your own company, basically. But with the law, you're obliged to have certain, however small risk coverage and so on with pension fund and so on.
Right. So Peter, how does that work with the AG and GmbH in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think AG GmbH is quite similar because you as a startup entrepreneur always an employee of your own company, and what we typically see that in the early days you keep your salary as low as possible because every Swiss franc you get into your pocket will be used for further growth. So that's quite common that to have your salary as low as possible. That of course means your pension fund is not growing as well. So you're taking a certain risk to that end, but that's something you have to take possibly as an entrepreneur because you get all the upside in case you can possibly sell your business at the later stage. What we sometimes see, in particular, if the company is growing and maybe gets profitable at a certain stage, from my perspective, it's important to adjust your salary over the years in line with the progress you make as a business and as you grow as an organization. Because otherwise you really risk that you might have a fast-growing startup, but you don't really have a safety net or only a small safety net with your pension fund on the other side. We sometimes hear entrepreneurs saying, okay, listen, I'm not interested in pension fund topics. I'm still very young, and my provision planning is the company because I'll be a successful entrepreneur, so I don't need pension fund. That's something we hear quite often. That can go very well, but it can also go quite bad. So this is something we also discuss quite early in order to make sure you're not too much dependent on the success of your company.
Yeah. It just comes to mind, higher risk, high reward. I think that's also very applicable here.
Obviously, the entrepreneurs don't like to hear too much, but I think it's important to address it. And then they go for their decision and might go their route anyway. And sometimes the business proves them right when they can sell their business and are financially independent afterwards. Yeah.
But there I fully agree. I think it's important that it's a conscious decision, not just, it just happened to me. I didn't really make that decision consciously. and that you really think about it and then choose the right strategy for yourself.
Yeah, because in particular, publicly you typically hear only the good stories, right?
True.
The nice exits and everything went out quite nicely, but you also, of course, see some situations where do you then go back into a corporate job or maybe find another way of living afterwards, and then it's good to not have all the eggs in one place. Yeah.
Exactly. So Patrick, in that regard, you also have tax aspects that you have to consider when founding a company, and also again depending on the legal structure. So what can you talk about in that regard?
It's quite a difference if you have an individual company or corporation, also tax-wise. You have to think if you're running an individual company, you are taxed on your business profit with income tax as a private person, basically, together with all the other private factors you have, rental income out of investments, and so on. So it might be at the beginning quite interesting, especially if you in a ramp-up mood producing losses, so you can deduct them against the other income. Of course, that might be attractive, and that's technically speaking, there's only one tax subject. And that's completely in contrast to the corporation or the GmbH, where the business result, they are taxed individually with profit taxes within the legal entity. And the income taxes, they may arise if you draw a salary, of course, or if you pay out dividends into your private wealth, then the income taxes are kicked in. And that's in my opinion, the main difference, of course, in taxes.
Got it. And I'm sure you also have something to add here, Peter, with your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an entrepreneurial perspective, the most important thing is really if you plan at some point in time to potentially sell your company and your business. And there is, of course, the benefit of tax-free capital gains. And if you have an AG and you sell the corporation, then you can benefit from tax-free capital gains. If you have an individual company, for instance, then when you sell the business, it's fully taxed. So you definitely get the benefit from the Swiss tax systems here. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a very important point to consider, which you cannot just change last minute when you're about to sell the company. That doesn't work.
Nope.
No, definitely not. You definitely have to think at least 5 years ahead if you start off with an individual company. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
So these topics, they all sound pretty complicated, but I think you gave us a very good overview. But still, people might be a bit overwhelmed and say, hey, what kind of help and support should I actually look for at the beginning to get that right? What can you recommend in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, what we discuss a lot now is about legal form and taxes, and I definitely think having a good lawyer is of importance when you speak to maybe more seasoned entrepreneurs who have made their way already. When they look back, what they typically tell us that you shouldn't save money on the law firm side. So it's definitely worthwhile to look out for a good startup lawyer who knows the game. Then obviously it's important to have the insurance in place, and then of course you need a good banking partner. So that's why we also as a UBS focus on young entrepreneurs. We have our UBS Start Business, which is a landing page for all startuppers, where they get in one platform an ecosystem of different solutions, not only actually banking services but also additional services. So I think there are lots of people that along the journey will become more and more important. But I think it's important to choose very early on the right partners. In particular, if you have in mind maybe to grow internationally, to scale the business, to make sure you already have a partner with you that can go with you, maybe possibly also abroad. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's actually a good keyword, growing company. So now we talked about the early days, the beginning, the foundations of your company. But now the company is growing. We have more revenue. We have more employees. What sort of tax implications does that have on my company, but also on me on a personal level, Patrick?
With the success of a growing company, usually the first tax issue that pops up privately for the entrepreneur is the wealth taxes. Market value brings tax value, and that ends usually in a higher tax burden or wealth tax burden here in Switzerland. Among other things, as you know, the entrepreneurs have to pay the wealth taxes on the value of the company, and it's sometimes hard to establish the real value since we do not have stock exchange prices for a non-listed company. And therefore, the authorities, they evaluate the company usually using a formula of a capitalized earnings value and the net asset value due to that lack of market price. But the implication of, for example, if an investor is coming in a financing round, what is the implication of that? Is that a relevant market value for tax reason or not? That's a big discussion we had in the past. Yeah. And luckily not, at least in the canton of Zurich. Here in Zurich, the current rule is that a startup which is in an active and a scalable business and does not generate any income streams or profits already is usually really looked at the startup and valuated at the base of the net asset value. And that's a big advantage, of course, here in the canton of Zurich. And however, if these companies in questions are no longer subject to this point of view from the tax authorities, the wealth taxes are kicking in and usually or often skyrocket.
And
be prepared.
Yeah, exactly.
Be prepared,
and that can happen quite fast because you for instance, start to become profitable, and at the same time you're still growing your business. You potentially bring in new investors at that stage to scale up and further invest. And then, of course, you actually have the situation that you face significant wealth tax in a situation where you, as an entrepreneur, might still have quite a low salary, actually. So there's no private funds to finance the taxes, and this potentially is also at the point in time where you maybe start to have family or look after to buy a property. So it's from a liquidity perspective, you could tell it's a bit the valley of death in a sense that the company is growing and you're successful, but you're having good times, but you don't have the money to pay the bills. Exactly. And that's quite a tricky situation where you need financing support. Yeah.
I'd like to go a bit into more detail here, Patrick. So the wealth tax burden is likely to have far-reaching consequences. I could imagine an extreme scenario where you would eventually have to even sell some of your shares to have the liquidity. So can you talk a bit more about these implications and how to deal with them?
Yeah. You know, this wealth tax issue usually can often trigger kind of a chain reaction. So that means the startup salary is no longer sufficient to pay your wealth taxes or your expenses you have with your family and your private life, of course. So that means you have to pay yourself a higher salary, possibly even pay out dividends, which is usually not the first thing investors are happy to see when they invest in a company. And usually it's also for the entrepreneur himself, not the way he wants to go, because he draws capital out of the company who would be better invested within the company to follow the vision and the plans of the company, of course. But however, you really have to think about your overall compensation in a higher salary, in a higher dividend payouts, and that raises again, of course, taxes. You then have the money to pay the taxes, but it raises additional taxes, and therefore you look for ways for deductible things to lower your tax burden again. And that's that's the latest point when also pension plans and voluntary buy-ins and so on are coming into focus. And last but not least, of course, it's also, as we mentioned before, tax rates of profit taxes between 12-20%. Speaking of income taxes, we speak of a difference from 22 to 44, 45 at the top max. So you may also want to choose your domicile wisely. Exactly.
In that regard, what would you recommend? Would you recommend to also increase your salary as the company grows, to not have this negative surprise from one day to the other, or what would your recommendation be?
I think it has to be aligned all the time. At the beginning, it's clear you won't be able to have a high salary. But as I mentioned before, this kind of chain reaction triggers you to really have a higher salary, which also makes sense. If the company is growing, the risk you've taken, you should be also paid basically for that risk, and therefore in my opinion, it should be aligned.
Yeah, and maybe adding to what you just said, I think what we also see sometimes, instead of taking out dividends in order to be able to pay taxes and stuff, we have seen secondary transactions. So if there is an investor funding round with new investors coming in, bringing fresh money to the company, you take the opportunity as an existing shareholder, as a founder, to sell a small part of your shares, so that you already create a certain liquidity on the one hand side to be able to pay the bills, but also to possibly de-risk at this point in time, where you bring some part of your entrepreneurial illiquid wealth, what we call the iceberg, into your private wealth, and then you're financially a bit more independent from the success of your company. Something we have seen more and more in the last years. Obviously, quite at the late stage. Typically, if you're still early on, investors don't like you to already at least partially exit your participation, but definitely something worth to consider on your journey.
Yeah, I really like that development, because it wasn't that used to be that way in the past, and I think it's so crucial to have founders with the peace of mind to be able to really chase the vision and go and build a big company, and not having this liquidity squeeze when then they have to give up or things go south, that you actually have the opportunity to sell parts of your share. It's really a tiny bit, just to get enough liquidity to have a less stressful financial life on the personal level.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to have the owner agendas aligned of all the founders, because that's possibly also a point in time where you might see, okay, there are different opinions on where the company should go. Should we bring in new investors, which means, the company potentially grows into a larger cake, but your portion of the cake will get smaller. And this is also the point in time where we sometimes see entrepreneurs leaving the company, also because sometimes they don't like the company to become too big. Kind of they get small corporate organizations, and this is also a point in time where you have to align again your private ideas and your private life with the agenda of the company. Yeah,
absolutely. And in that regard, now we talked about income and earnings growth, but of course you also have a headcount growth. You hire more people to grow more rapidly as a company. And that, of course, also has implications, because you potentially want to think about, employee participation and stock options and everything. So what have you seen here, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. I think as the company grows, you need new talent. You might need different kind of people. So you might need also higher profiles, where you as a startup might not be in a position to pay actually market wages in line with market. So you kind of need in other ways to incentivize people to come and work for your company. And that's why we see also at this point in time where companies establish employee participation plans.
And this is definitely the time when you need an expert. Setting up employee stock option plan and the like is really quite a complex matter, and it's not easy to set up. You really have to distinguish between equity-based or equity-linked compensation forms. Though that means depending on the setup you choose at the beginning, especially the tax consequences, they're completely different. They vary from a fully taxable event for the employee up to a tax-free capital gain, and that's the difference we're speaking of at the end. So if you look at equity-based, that means you're getting shares or at least options to buy one day in the future shares of the company, and it's the only way basically to achieve under certain conditions a tax-free capital gain in the future for employees. On the other hand, if we discuss equity-linked programs, programs, we often speak of phantom stocks, for example, which are kind of a replication of the original shares. They even can pay hybrid dividends and so on. But you will never face a tax-free event. It's always taxed, and so there's a huge difference in how to set up these different plans.
Yeah, I think we'll do like an episode just about that topic to really go into the analysis about what makes sense and what doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now you grow the company, and also the size of the company changes. Obviously, the question of the role of the founders also arises. And what observations do you make here, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. Sometimes you see that the founder or the founders who might have been, the guys providing the vision and maybe being the brain behind the idea and the product, when the company starts to grow very fast and there might still be part of the executive team, they might not have as much fun as they had back in the days because now they have to manage people. So this point in time where also some of the founders have to think, do I step back? Do I bring in a professional management team to step in and take this managerial role? But this also the point in time where some of the entrepreneurs might consider, not only am I the right person to run the business, but also am I the right owner of the business? So where you actually also make considerations about your owner agenda. And if you as a private person together with your founders are still the right persons to bring the company to a next level. Because if you have a certain size and you maybe want to become big to further reach your vision, you might need additional power, be it financially or operationally, to reach your goals.
And also the sale of the company might be an option to consider in that regard, right? To really say, hey, I sell my baby. It's time to hand it over and to also cash in on the value that we built over the past years.
Yeah, that might be a result of that discussion where you realize, okay, maybe I'm not the right owner anymore. Mm-hmm. But what we also see sometimes that this happens quite out of the blue, right, where you get someone just popping up and making you an offer where you didn't really expect to happen. This is also a point in time where you say, okay, now what do I really want as a person also? Mm-hmm. What do I want to reach as a person, but also where do I want to go with the business? Yeah.
So now let's assume that we are aligned and want to actually sell our company. And what do you need to consider there? That, of course, also has some tax implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So for selling a company, you have to be ready for that transaction. First of all, on an operational basis, your business has to run smooth. You have to have the people aligned within the company and prepare them for a new way to go, basically. And also on the other hand, on the tax perspective, in Switzerland, entrepreneurs, they have the unique possibility to sell their business tax-free, and that's really unique here in Switzerland. So, but that doesn't come for free. It's something you really have to prepare and really have to focus on your legal structure, on your balance sheet. How is it structured? What are non-operating assets on the balance sheet, and so on. And that needs some time and some planning in advance. But if you prepare wisely, it's really the ultimate goal usually in Switzerland to achieve that tax-free capital gain here in Switzerland.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure you've also seen a few M&A deals happening, Peter. So what is your observation there?
Yeah, I mean, you cannot start too early, as Patrick said. There are lots of financial stuff you can address early on in order to make sure it's tax-wise optimized. There are lots of operational stuff you have to make sure that, for instance, the company is not too much dependent on the key personnel. But I think it's also important to have an idea how much your company is worth, so that you also among the owners have an idea on what could be a potential price you would be willing to sell your company. In particular, that's good if you receive an offer, maybe unexpectedly, if you have an idea on what the company should be worth and have a good shareholder agreement where you also aligned on what happens in which scenario, this is something you should address early on. And then if maybe there is an offer and pops up, or we always tell our client, even if that's a very good and exciting moment, don't go exclusively with the very first one, because it's definitely advisable to look into alternatives. To potentially also maximize the price of the sale of your company, increase the range of possible buyers, and last but not least, also make sure you're not getting too much involved into these negotiations. That's why we say it's definitely advisable to have M&A advice from experts that support you on this journey.
Yeah, I mean, these negotiations, they can keep you up day and night, and you still have a business to run. So
absolutely,
that's very advisable to get some support there.
And it's also getting emotional, right?
Yeah.
And this is also good if you have someone, that maybe does at least part of the negotiation for you. Because these processes are quite long and sometimes cumbersome and I mean, I've never done it, but I've been close to entrepreneurs who went through it, and so it's quite exhausting. Yeah,
absolutely.
But potentially then worth the journey, of course.
So let's assume that we've done our homework. We are ready for a successful exit. I can imagine that there are still any tax pitfalls that we should take care of, or at least consider, to not fall into any traps there.
Yeah, I think there's one which is probably the most discussed one. That's the indirect partial liquidation. But as it's discussed so much or so often, it's really hard to step into that trap, in my opinion. But a more likely pitfall might be an earnout, for example, because the valuation of a company and the purchase price is not always clear at the time of closing. Often a certain part of the price is deferred into the future and paid into the future. And from a tax perspective, that might arise certain questions, of course. So really, as an entrepreneur, as a seller, you want to have, again, this tax-free capital gain. But tax authorities may look different at this one. The more it's connected to achieving a certain turnover, achieving a certain EBITDA and so on, the more they look at it as a part of your salary for the future. And the salary is taxable in Switzerland. It's not tax-free, as we know. And this discussion may arise, of course, in the future. So it's really wise to have a focus on earnouts and best even to address them openly with the seller, with the buyer, and also with the tax authorities, and get, in the best case, a ruling what's taxable and what's not taxable.
That's the beauty of Switzerland. You can just call up the tax authorities and ask for a ruling before actually closing the deal. I think that's amazing, really.
That's unique as well. It's unique as well in Switzerland. It really gives you good planning, security. Yeah,
absolutely. So now the last step is basically the closing. The deal is sealed. The company is sold. What's next, Peter?
Yeah, what's next? I mean, that's quite an important milestone in the life of an entrepreneur. Of course, you have sometimes serial entrepreneurs who went through this more than once. But I think this point in time where you sell your company and then you have a pile of money sitting in your accounts, that's quite an important one. And normally entrepreneurs are not really prepared for this, right? Because they've always been entrepreneurs. They've been used to taking decisions and being involved and being an entrepreneur. And from one point to the other, they're not entrepreneurs anymore, but they become investors. Now, we sometimes see entrepreneurs, they're still young. They say, okay, what's next? So they're looking for the next business venture. So they become entrepreneurial again, maybe a bit more relaxed because they have more financial resources to invest. But definitely the transition from an entrepreneur to an investor is an important one. And here we also at UBS, in our desk particular, we also support entrepreneurs on their journey when they still have the iceberg, when I told you before, but when the iceberg actually goes belly up, and then you have the cash sitting in your accounts, making sure that your funds are well diversified, and you have a good take sufficient time to think about your values, to go through wealth structuring and make sure you have a good plan for the future. And what we quite often see that entrepreneurs, they want to stay entrepreneurial. Sometimes, depending on where they stand in life, maybe don't want to be too much involved in businesses, but they're eager to invest and support young entrepreneurs looking at their selves some years ago. And this is also nice at UBS because we have also the private investor circle platform, where we actually have a platform where we support young businesses, growing businesses looking for funding, and we match them together with successful entrepreneurs who have exited their business. So kind of the circle closes, and where everything starts again from scratch, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I think if you're up for it, that's the perfect way to end this episode, and end it with a few rapid fire questions.
All right.
So I give you a choice or a short question. We switch between the two of you, and you can basically just answer it in one sentence, okay? So the first one for you, Patrick, sole proprietorship or an AG?
AG, definitely.
Clear choice. For you, Peter, VC money or bootstrapping?
Difficult one. I would say bootstrapping in the early days until you go for Series A, and then you bring in investors. But it also, I mean, it's a typical question where you say it depends,
right? Because
depends also on what businesses you're in. For instance, if you're into the tech business, then you might have already venture capital investors early on.
Exactly. For you, Patrick, Zurich or Zug?
Come on. Say Lucerne.
Lucerne.
That's where the heart wins. That's fair. we let that count. That's okay.
Okay.
And for you, being the biggest fish in Switzerland, the number one here in the local market, or being a smaller fish in an international market?
Being a small fish in an international market, I would say.
Okay, fair point. And for you, how many hours of sleep did you get last night, Patrick?
Around 6.
Okay, fair point.
Yeah.
And one last point for investment decisions. What would you rather buy, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general, a stock ETF, or invest in a startup company?
I would go for a mix of it all, but definitely not too much of Bitcoin. I would rather focus on ETF and startups.
Fair point. Yeah. Cool. So Peter, Patrick, thank you so much for stopping by. It was a pleasure talking to you, and all the best with the interesting cases and cool entrepreneurs that you're actually helping and supporting along the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.